The bill now be read the second time. The honourable member for Murchison.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to address my mind to the bill. I want to just make a couple of comments at the outset. It is a bit disappointing we're dealing with this all in one day, this legislation, and dealing with it after getting it for the first sight yesterday morning. And I do appreciate the briefings that we had yesterday afternoon and this morning, but it is a pretty big task, particularly as it covers so many pieces of legislation, and when you read them in context with the acts they're amending, it is a big piece of work. So it's disappointing that the government made a decision to only sit one day and try and both do it in one day, when I know the Premier and Minister for Health particularly are very busy at the moment and have a lot of other commitments, the Premier with the National Cabinet and other considerations. But they only need to sit one day and we can sit another. And it's disappointing that we look to be doing exactly the same thing next week. And I think that's a problem. And I think other members may speak more about that another time, but I think this could be done so much better. Parliament's been recalled for the purpose of dealing with emergency legislation. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't get full scrutiny and shouldn't be properly considered. So it makes our task very difficult, as our job is to ensure that it is adequately scrutinised. So I don't know whether the other place will change their mind when they adjourn tomorrow morning. Nice for them to go home and have a night's sleep. Disrespectful to our House. If it's an emergency bill, they should stay here and wait. Anyway, good for them to go and have a night's sleep. We don't get that. So I hope that when they do come back tomorrow, they reconsider when they return next week and possibly consider returning on Wednesday and start the legislation next week. That obviously is complex, otherwise we would have been dealing with it today as well. So I hope the leader might take that back to Mr Ferguson, who seems to be in charge of these things.
To you, Mr President. And it could be finished in one day on the Wednesday, or we could go on to the Thursday. So
that's right.
It could be a one-day episode. Just gives you that more flexibility than going Thursday, Friday. Mm-hmm. It just makes sense.
So, Mr President, just reflecting on the Covid19 Act that we passed I don't know how long ago it was now, whenever it was. It seems like 2 years ago to me.
6 weeks ago, 17th of March 2020.
It feels like 2 years ago. Every day seems like a week at the moment to me. My days are that long. But Mr President, I remember at that time making the comment that it was so nice to see my diary emptying out and all that time we'd have. I should never say anything like that.
No.
Because my days have been 14 hours long every day, 7 days a week, with no let up. And part of that has been, I think, with my background in health, I have a greater understanding of the implications of this virus, but also my electorate has been the heart of the outbreak that Tasmania has seen, that has drawn international and national media attention. It's been very, very difficult for the people of my electorate, but particularly for the healthcare workers who have been vilified in this situation. I got a message just a while ago from one of my constituents to say she pulled up at the fuel station to get fuel so she can get to work tomorrow and was abused at the petrol station for being a healthcare worker who caused this outbreak.
Absolutely disgusting.
Okay, so when are people in Tasmania going to stop being such mongrels?
Not all people.
No, it's not, but there's enough of them, and this goes on top of comments by the Chief Medical Officer, and I called him out very early in the piece, and I thank the Premier for calling him out, for relying on rumour and innuendo and absolutely destroying the souls of so many of our nurses and doctors on the northwest coast. Some of these young nurses have just graduated and started the job, and that's what they're told. I don't think, unless you actually put yourself in the shoes of those people for even 5 seconds, you've got no idea of the harm that this caused these people who are then locked up in quarantine, often without anybody to protect their families, in a hotel room for 2 weeks. None of us have had to do that. None of us have had to be separated from our families. None of us have had to suffer the vilification, the rumour-mongering and the hate that has been thrown at some of these people. Some of these people who put their lives on the line for us, who turn up when things are really tough. And as the report that was released today, Mr. President, I haven't had time to read it all, but I certainly will. It alludes to or it talks about the reality that nurses turn up for work. When you're busy, I've been there. And if you've just got home after an 8-hour shift and a midwife rings you and says, look, we're desperate, Ruth, 4 women have just come in labour, can you come back? You don't say, oh no, sorry, I'm a bit tired. You say, sure. And you go back. Because you don't let your colleagues down. And to think that these nurses who were working on the medical ward, who may have been infectious and not known it because they had no symptoms, would have decided that because they were working on medical ward, but they felt well, they won't go to work today. Just in case they might be infectious because there's a couple of COVID patients on the ward. They don't do that.
They'd feel devastated, actually.
Yeah, look, some of the messages I've received and some of the things I've read on social media, and some of the phone calls I've had, Mr. President, when people are in isolation for 14 days, they've got a lot of time on their hands. And when they ring me to talk to me about what's happening for them, I listen. And I might have to listen for an hour for some of them, because they've got all the time in the world. I might not, and I didn't, but for them I did, because it mattered to them to be heard. So we then had the Prime Minister stick his bib in as well. And again, same thing. So it's been really tough in my electorate, and we've still got problems up there now, and I just hope that people from other parts of the state can pull their heads in, particularly on the live feed of the Premier's updates.
I know.
There's some absolute trolls on there. Absolute trolls.
Totally agree.
And anyway, Mr. President, I think maybe the ABC could do a little moderating. I'm not sure what they do there, but it's particularly the ABC site that they're worse. They're pretty bad on the Mercury side as well. I have 3 sites going at once. I keep an eye on the Premier's site, which is often pretty good. As far as the comments there, the Mercury's, the ABC's pretty crap at times, I'd say. Anyway, I do engage because I want to counter some of that, because I know some of these health workers in isolation are watching this. So people ought to give some thought to that. So, Mr. President, those comments made, I just wanted to help make people realise how it's so important that we all stick together in this. We do no finger pointing, we do no blaming, we look for learnings and we learn from those. We look for how to prevent this getting any worse, and acknowledging at any time it could get worse anywhere in Tasmania.
Hear, hear.
And if it does, I'll be out there backing the area that it is in. I hope it doesn't, but if it does, you'll hear no vilification from me, no criticism from me, no blaming from me, only support and encouragement and help if I can. So, Mr. President, I also want to thank the Premier, the Minister for Health, Minister Courtney, the Deputy Premier and their staff and the Commissioner of Police for being so available to assist me in the work in my electorate. I know that there's been publicly spoken about in other parts, but I do want to acknowledge that back the other way, how important that has been to be able to get responses and get action and get the answers I've needed to assist the people of my electorate, and broader than that at times. I don't ask people where they're from. If they come to me for assistance, I'll help them as much as I can. So, Mr. President, I just want to make those points before I address this bill. So, Mr President, the bill that's before us, as I said at the outset, does cover a range of areas, and I want to speak to probably 2 or 3 of them, just not at any great length, but just to raise some key issues, or key points rather, with them. I know that the election for the... Sorry, I've got a bit emotional, I just need to blow my nose.
Now, you've had a test and we know you're negative, so it's okay.
Yeah. In fact, one of your staff called me the negative Ruth Forrest, he said. And I thought he was being rather nasty, but he told me he wasn't.
He wasn't. He
was being quite funny. He was trying to be, yeah. Anyway, so the Legislative Council elections were scheduled for the beginning of May this year. It's been a bit of an ongoing feast of trying to figure out what's the best thing to do. And I've had some communication with a number of people about this. It is a matter of great interest because our elections are important. Democracy in this state is dependent on it. And I think every person, every constituent in Tasmania deserves representation. So it is important that we do have an elected member of all seats at all times, except perhaps in this circumstance where a member dies and we've got a period before that a by-election can be held, or they retire for some other reason, or resign for some other reason. So we do need some certainty around this, and whilst it doesn't give us certainty, it gives us a process to undertake that. At the moment, if this bill isn't supported, this part of the bill wasn't supported, we still have an emergency notice issued under the Covid19 Act that deals with that, and I'm not sure why that's not really suitable in some respects, because it calls for an election to be held in June, July or August. But I do accept that we don't know how long these restrictions are going to go on. But Mr President, there was a letter sent from the Electoral Commissioner to yourself, I think it was the 17th of March or something. Sorry, 17th of April, that I would like to not read out, but seek leave to have it tabled and included into Hansard, and also a subsequent follow-up letter that was circulated today by the leader after I emailed the leader back regarding information the Electoral Commissioner provided at the briefing yesterday. But before I do seek leave, I would like to just refer to some points in his second communication particularly, because I was also thinking that it made sense for consideration to be given to a full postal vote in terms of actually facilitating the election. But his comments yesterday and then this today did explain, and I will, it will appear as part of my speech if people agree to have this tabled and incorporated. But he sets out in this the aspects of the Electoral Act that make our elections to this place the important democratic process they are. And he also goes on to say, outside of the legislative issues, any changes to this 120-year-old system should include consideration of other important aspects of Tasmania's electoral processes and rituals that create public consent and electoral mandate. The inability to open any polling places removes one of the core elements of our democratic system and would make it much more difficult for some electors to vote. The conduct of a universal postal ballot does not enable an elector to attend a polling place on polling day to cast their vote. The removal of this key right under the Act may make the election highly contestable. And Mr President, that was one thing that concerned me, that if we went down that path, that the election could be contestable. So you've got, I don't know how many candidates in each seat there'll be, but someone wins, and a losing opponent then challenges it under the fact that it was held as a full postal vote, as it may not be a valid vote. So imagine the trauma of all of that and going through all of that. So in my mind, that was quite convincing to me of the need to actually make sure that there is an opportunity for people to attend a polling booth. I did ask the Commissioner at the briefing yesterday about whether the election can occur while we still are under a state of emergency or a public health emergency, and his answer was that it can, but they'd have to make sure and they'd have to have the approval of the Director of Public Health to facilitate that. And we talked about measures that can be taken to protect not only the public but also electoral staff, like perspex shields and barriers between electoral staff and voters, and obviously social distancing in a booth, but also the proactive sending out of applications for postal votes to encourage people to exercise that option if they chose. So I think if those things are being considered, then I think this is probably an effective model. But I don't think it should go on and on. I think this should be something that's constantly reviewed, and I'm sure as we're coming back over the coming weeks, is a question that probably I or other members don't ask the government, is what progress is being made in that. We don't have to wait for the emergency to end, according to this, for an election to occur. So I think that they're questions that we will ask. So, Mr. President, I seek leave to table these two communications from the Electoral Commission and have them incorporated into my speech.
The Honourable Member for Murchison seeks leave to table documents and have them incorporated into Hansard. The question is leave granted? Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.
So, Mr. President, just to move on from that aspect of the bill, the provisions regarding the Tasmanian Health Service and the opportunity or the need to enable, I'm just trying to fire off my notes on this, Mr. President, to actually enable the public hospital to provide other services or purchase other services that aren't contained in the service plan, in the current service plan. I'm just wondering why, and the leader may need to respond to this in her reply to the debate, but what was the barrier to perhaps issuing an emergency notice to enable the purchase of those services or things that will be facilitated under this provision? Or was it just that it was determined to do it through legislation for the purposes of the Covid-19 emergency, rather than rely on the notice? Because there's an opportunity to provide a notice to achieve that, to amend the service plan or the service level agreement. So, that was the only thing I wanted to ask on that one, I think. So when we just get into the matters regarding the amendments to the the Emergency Management Act and the inclusion of infringement notices, and I know there was a lot of discussion about the member for Windermere alluded to these points as well, and particularly the enduring nature of some of these in some aspects. Personally, I don't see a problem with the inclusion of infringement notices. I think it would have been quite helpful in my electorate for the police to actually issue an infringement notice rather than have to basically issue a summons to a person, because whilst it's, the person then thinks, damn it, I've got to go to court. If you could issue them an infringement notice where they actually pay a fine up front, basically, then they're more likely to think, well, I won't do that again. Then they get the summons, they think, oh, that's off in the distance, and particularly at the moment, that's off, so off they go again and do what they were doing, not following some of the instructions about staying home, and not perhaps abiding by other measures. When we look at the Public Health Act and the emergency under that, some of these offences have potentially very serious ramifications, and this was talked about to some degree in the briefing, and I know that it's pretty common knowledge that we've got some challenges up in the northwest coast with potential further outbreaks related to the Northwest Regional Hospital outbreak and the origins of that. to have the capacity for police to actually issue an infringement notice right there, right now, right there, right then, I believe will have a much more meaningful impact on people's behaviour, particularly as a public health officer or a council officer can do it anyway.
Yeah, I can't see that.
And I think we've asked the police to be out there now, and they are, checking on where people are going and why they're going there, and turning them around if they're just heading off down to Bunnings in Launceston or whatever it might be. They've been turned around. Many have been warned. There's been some arrested. But some of the other serious offences are people not abiding by their quarantine arrangements. Okay, that's very serious, Mr. President. If you're in quarantine because you're COVID positive, that's very serious. If you're in quarantine because you've been exposed to a COVID positive patient or person, you may be infectious yourself. That's very serious. So those people may well be arrested and summoned, yes, but at least there's an opportunity if it's what the police would consider and they use their discretion to say, well, this is a lower level offence, then they've got a larger suite of actions. And it is the police who are out there doing this. It's not the council staff, and it's not often the public health officers. It's the police. We've called on the police to be doing this. We've called on them to be out there checking on the people in quarantine. You've seen it on your social media, you've seen it on the news. You've got someone in quarantine and the police go and they ring the person from outside. The person comes out and puts their identification documents on the step. They step back. The police officer goes up with the basic PPE on, has a look at the identification, checks it, reminds them of their obligations, and off they go. That's the police doing that. Okay?
Through you, Mr. President, they do more than that too.
I'm just saying this, but I'm saying what I'm saying is
they do ask, are you okay?
No, but I'm saying we're asking the police to do this. We're not asking the public health officers to do this.
Yeah.
It's the police. Yeah. We're asking the police to stop people out there in front of your place at house and ask them where they're going.
They do.
I know, that's what we're asking the police to do that. We're not asking the public health officers to do that. We're asking the police to do that. And so to me it makes sense to give the police the opportunity here to issue a basically on-the-spot fine as a more timely deterrent to doing the wrong thing. So, Mr. President, I did ask in relation to the penalties that are being included in or increased in the Public Health Act for directions made under a notifiable and infectious disease that's outside of the public health emergency period. What other jurisdictions have? And I'm hopeful that her staff, her advisors will have some information about those other the penalties in other jurisdictions, in terms of the monetary penalty and jail term, potential custodial sentence. So if they could do that, that would be helpful. Just as a comparison, I think it may be helpful during the committee stage of the debate. So, Mr. President, they're the points I wanted to make. I think the other matters related to the registration of vehicles being suspended for a period, or the wheelchair accessible taxis that they're running out of the time when they normally would need to be replaced. I think that's sensible in this time. We need those services to remain available. A lot of those operators are having struggles anyway because people aren't moving around as much, they're not using them as much, so it's a pragmatic and sensible approach. And I know that there was some work already being done on that by the government before all this happened, so this may provide some relief. I think there's probably more work to be done in the longer term there, but that's a matter for another day. So, Mr. President, I support the intent of the bill. I'll be listening to any other amendments that are being proposed, but I do thank members for indulgence for allowing me to speak about the harm that's been done to some people in my electorate through the behaviour of others. And in one final comment on that, I do want to acknowledge and thank the really hard-working staff of the Launceston General Hospital, who have taken on the patients of the Northwest. The majority of them, some have gone to the Mersey, but any with a higher acuity than what can be dealt with at the Mersey have all gone to the LGH. These are sicker people. including a COVID patient. The Mersey took the COVID patients from Burnie, and so I thank the Mersey staff for them as well, because that's a huge task and a frightening task to be caring for a positive patient. And I particularly thank the LGH midwives. They had one of the busiest days and busiest months they've ever had, and that was before the Northwest Women turned up. They just added to the top of that. So it's been extraordinarily busy for those nurses and midwives. They've worked double shifts. They've done everything they can to help the women who are struggling with having to travel 4 hours. I've had women from the Arthur River who run a farm with their husband. The woman relocated to Launceston. Her husband went back, 4 hours back, so she could wait until she was in labour. Then when she went to labour, because he had to run the farm, he came back 4 hours again to be with her during labour. Okay? So that's the sort of thing that women in my electorate had to do, families had to do. So it's been a huge task. And I've directly assisted, I think, about a quarter of the women who were due in this period. And there's still some that are in Launceston because we haven't got full maternity services at the Northwest Private Hospital open again yet. So I do acknowledge that the work of the Launceston midwives. They've done a fantastic job, and I know that they've been under enormous pressure. So thank you to them, and I support the intent of the bill.